Memorial service in the chapel. Let's get started here. Those of you who attended the last class will remember, or at least I will remind you, that the first class was supposed to be about the Torah, and this class is about the second part of the division of Tanakh, which is Nach. That is Neviim, which means prophets, although the truth is that the division is not just about prophets, but about judges, Samuel, kings, in other words, the narrative portion of Israel coming into the land, and then all of the prophets that you know, which are the three major prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, and the Treasar, the 12 minor prophets. No, we are not going to talk about all of them. Because the idea was, although this may not work for the third division, that we're going to do one on the Torah, one on the narratives and prophets, and one on the writings, but we may divide the writings up into a couple of sessions because one or two of the books, I think, deserve their own. Not that every book doesn't, but at least for the moment, we're going to focus on this. Now, in order to really enter the spirit of this class, you have to have a certain amount of historical empathy, by which I mean you have to imagine the Israelites have crossed the desert. No matter what you think did or didn't happen historically, they are now in the land, however they got there. And clearly they got there one way or another because Israel had 1,000 years in the land or more before they were kicked out of the land. So what happens to a people when they first come to the land that they are supposed to inherit? Imagine that you have had all this direction about what you should do when you go into the land, and then you actually get to the land. There's a certain parallel to the reality of professional school and a profession. People will always tell you, law school didn't prepare me for the legal world, rabbinical school didn't prepare me for the rabbinate, medical school didn't prepare me to be a doctor. In other words, there is no such thing, honestly, as preparation for real life when it hits. Life is, to borrow the phrase of the French writer André Gide, life is fired at you point blank. That is, there's no way to get ready for what actually happens. And the Israelites, who presumably spent 40 years in the desert getting ready for the moment that they came into the land, then they came into the land, and it was a mess. The first book that we encounter after the books of the Bible is Joshua. And Joshua doesn't actually tell a story of all of a sudden the land was swept in front of us. There is assimilation, there's battle, there's all sorts of things. What there isn't is a land of milk and honey that flows with perfection and beauty, that the Israelites just come and settle and everything is fine. And I would say most Jews in our community, most Jews in general, don't know this because they never get to Joshua. They get to the end of Deuteronomy, and then they go back to the beginning of Genesis, and that's the cycle of the Torah reading. And I don't know very many Jews who say, I spend a lot of time reading Joshua, and I have questions. The truth is they read Joshua more in Israel for obvious reasons than they do in the diaspora, because Joshua is all about conquering the land. So the one story that everybody knows outside of Israel is the story of Joshua and Jericho, with all the shofrot, or the trumpets, knocking down the walls. And the truth is, given the preponderance of archaeological evidence, the conquest of Jericho probably happened many, 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 many years before the Israelites came into the land. So the one place that we all know we conquered, we probably didn't. But whether we did or not, in one way or another, what happens is gradually, Israel starts to assimilate their way, conquer their way into the land. And now the question becomes, unlike the desert, where everyone knows who the ruler is and who God is, how do you rule this people in the land? And the most common phrase, it happens 4 times in the book of Judges. And just to keep you since I don't have a blackboard, it goes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, Judges, okay? So in the book of Judges, which comes right after Joshua, the most common phrase is Ish hayashar be'einav yaseh, which is everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Again and again and again, that's what happens. In other words, anarchy, chaos. Everybody, there's a Yiddish phrase, everybody's making Shabbos for themselves, right? There is no centralized power, because how do you get a centralized power in a tribal world where the most charismatic leader in your neighborhood becomes the leader? It's very much like gang warfare, right? And you have, if you haven't watched The Wire, then you really don't understand the book of Judges, because that's like when the charismatic leader arises in the projects, that's the guy that everyone follows until he gets knocked off by the next charismatic leader. And then that's the one that everyone follows. And so you get a really motley collection of judges, like some of them good. Deborah, good. Yiftach, not so good. That is, he's a good warrior, but on the other hand, he kills his own daughter. So, balance. The story of Yiftach, by the way, it's not like he wants to kill his own daughter. What happens is he says unwisely, when I come back from the war, whatever comes out of my house, I'm going to sacrifice, because remember that most houses had sheep and cattle and so on living in the house. Of course, what comes out of his house is his daughter. And while it does not say explicitly that he sacrifices her, that's the general understanding. And then you get someone like Samson, who I don't know how much you remember about Samson, if anything. It's in Judges, I think chapter 12. But Samson is basically a strong adolescent. That is, he's entirely ruled by his impulses. He's, without being too cavalier, Samson is like a biblical frat boy. He goes out with a lot of women, he beats up a lot of people, and then Delilah finally pesters him. She doesn't seduce him. It's not like, if you're thinking Victor, Mature, and Hedy Lamarr, then 1, you're old, and two, you haven't read the text. Hedy Lamarr seduces him. Hedy Lamarr, by the way, was Jewish. Hungarian Jew, brilliant woman, but that's a separate question. In the Bible, she pesters him until he finally tells her, okay, my strength is in my hair. Then, does Delilah cut his hair? If you say yes, then you're a victim of actually, she hires a barber. This is, as I have told classes for years, this is a great bar bet. Bet someone at the local bar that Delilah does not cut Samson's hair. You will win. She doesn't. She hires a barber who cuts his hair, and then he brings down the temple of the Philistines because he finally repents and God gives him back his strength. But the point is, the judges are not the kinds of leaders that we want for Israel to have. They're provisional, they're charismatic, they're frat boys. And all along the way, Israel is looking at other nations and saying, why can't we have a king like they have a king? Because if you have a king, then the various judges don't get to decide who is the power enthroned. And what happens then as you move to Samuel is that Samuel is the high priest. He's not a king. He's the high priest. But as we all know from history, sufficiently charismatic leadership has a real power in the world. And Samuel, for whatever reason, manages to persuade people that he is both honest enough and close enough to God that they should listen to him. And so Samuel is the de facto leader of Israel when the people come to him and say, we want a king like everyone else, because everyone else has a king. And one of the things that we don't credit sufficiently, and that's because we're not self-aware enough, is that Jews really want to be like everyone else. And the degree to which they cannot is the degree to which they end up being different. But there's a large part of the Jewish world that wants to be like everyone, which is why every time the Jewish world says, the non-Jewish world says, okay, you can assimilate, the Jews break down the walls to assimilate. Because everybody wants to be accepted. Nobody really wants to be a pariah. Nobody really wants to be an outcast. And the Jews say, everybody else has a king, and we want to be like everybody else and have our own king. Now, of course, you always want to be like everybody else, but better, right? We want our own king, but we want our king to be better than the Shmendra kings that surround us in Moab and Edom and so on and so forth. But we see how a king can unify a people and everyone can look up to them. And they have their heroes that endure, and they have kingships that go on from generation to generation. I mean, remember that for most of human history, until a couple of hundred years ago, kingship was the only kind of rulership that people could even imagine, right? I mean, today, in fact, since we're speaking history, today was the second time in the history of England that a royal was arrested. The second time. And that's a long stretch. Now, his fate will not be the same as the first king who was arrested in England, who was Charles I, who was really separated from his crown, if you understand my meaning. But kingship was the de facto means of ruling a people. And so in the end, Samuel has to relent. Despite the fact that he says to them correctly, don't you know that the king will accrue all this power and he'll take your taxes and he'll take your women and he'll take your horses and he'll take your this and he'll take your that. They still want a king. And in fact, we know that throughout history, kings have always accrued enormous power and wealth and everything else to themselves. And the reason that they did was because they could. That's what it means to be the king. But eventually they prevail on Samuel and on God. And despite the fact that God is, I don't know if you can call God ambivalent. God is ambivalent about giving them a king. God gives them a king. Now, this is going to be a big theme that most Jews are only dimly aware of. But Saul came from the tribe of, anyone want to take a stab at this? Benjamin. Benjamin was the child of whom? Jacob. But not just Jacob, but Rachel. Rachel had 2 kids before she died, Benjamin and Joseph, right? So Benjamin has a special status because he's not just Jacob's child, he's Rachel's child, and Rachel was the beloved of Jacob. All of the tribes, Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, Zebulun, on and on and on, those are the 12 tribes that dwelt in the north. In Israel, it was called. In everywhere that we think of as the northern part of Israel today, That was the territory where those 11 tribes dwelt, and the 12th tribe, Judah, dwelt in the south. Judah was the biggest tribe, okay? There were different traditions, different holy sites, different ideas, a real division between the north and the south. When if you know the parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament, that's because Samaria was in the north. And therefore, the Jews in the south, who in Jesus' time were the only Jews that were left, they thought that the Jews of the north were bad, and the Samaritans were bad, and Samaria was bad, and Jerusalem and the temple and the south, that was good. So you have this division between the north and the south. And the first king comes from the north. He comes from Benjamin, and that's Saul. Just keep that conflict in the back of your mind, because this is not a conflict, forget slavery for a minute, but this is not a conflict that we're unfamiliar with in American history. Put slavery aside, the North and the South were different cultures, and they did not get along, and they did not really like each other very much, and they both thought they were better. And if you'd ask somebody in 1860 or 1850, which is a better place, Charleston or New York, you could have had a very serious, like Charleston is what really matters, and New York doesn't really matter, and the real United States is in the South, not in the North, and so on. The same mentality prevailed with all the differences in time and place and culture. So Saul becomes the first king, and I'm not giving, this is not a spoiler, not a successful king. One of the ways that you know Saul is not going to be a successful king is because he's tall and handsome. And physical attributes in the Torah, Samson is strong, Saul is tall, Goliath is tall and strong. Like if you introduce somebody as tall and strong, they're going to get it in the neck. That's just the way it works in the Bible. Like it's almost as if it's saying physical attributes that you think of. It's not as if. God actually explicitly says this. God says to Jesse when Samuel goes off after Saul is already on the skids to make David the new king, God says to Samuel that God does not see the way human beings see. Ki Adam yireh le'einayim v'Hashem yireh le'levav. Because human beings see what's visible, but God sees into the heart. So in other words, a culture that prizes what you see is not the culture that the Bible treasures. And Saul eventually fails at the kingship, and David, who comes from the line eventually of going back of Judah, not of Benjamin, i.e. of the south, and not the north, becomes the king. So you can imagine how the northerners felt about David. When you see some of the rebellion against David, you know that it's fomented in the north because the north doesn't like the south. And I know that this is a motif that will not shock any of you, but this is one of the long, long story of Jews not getting along with each other. And so the South doesn't like the North, and the North doesn't like the South, and they don't like this upstart David. But David is smart enough, capable enough, charismatic enough, able enough. Anyway, there we go. These might be lights where you have to move. I don't know. It might be one of those things. And so David manages to eke out a kingship, and he does something that is very rare for kings in the ancient world or in the Middle Ages, which is he dies in his bed, right? And that almost by itself says you've been a successful king. And David manages to unite the kingship. He chooses Jerusalem because Jerusalem isn't too far in the south and it's not too far in the north. The truth is that Jerusalem doesn't have the advantages that a capital city would normally have, but it's kind of like Washington, D.C. It's not too southern, it's not too northern, it's kind of in the middle. And although David has his difficulties, not only in terms of his own sins, not only does he have difficulties, obviously, with Bathsheba, he commits adultery, he commits proxy murder, he does terrible things, but also he manages in the end not just to unite the kingdom, but to choose a successor. And for a king to secure a successor is really important. And David makes Solomon his successor. But the unity of the north and the south lasts only as long as Solomon. So you've got one united kingdom for David, for Solomon, and then under Solomon's kids, already it breaks apart again. And it breaks apart for 100 different reasons, but I will give you at least a couple because this is one of those things that, like, we think of the ancient world as very remote from us, but in terms of like the forces of human nature and politics, a lot of things don't change. So the two great powers is, think of Israel is here. This is this tiny Israel. Above it is Mesopotamia, this giant country that was Assyria, and then it was Babylonia, and so on. And below it is Egypt. And Egypt is a power in the south. Mesopotamia is the power in the north, okay? We know that during the time of the Exodus, Egypt was the prevailing power and it controlled Canaan. And that's why in Canaan you will find Egyptian names, Egyptian artifacts, and so on, because you would expect that in the same way that you would expect that if there was a tiny island off the United States, when you go there, you would find artifacts in English. Right? The same thing happens after David and Solomon. Assyria becomes the major power in the world. Now, if Assyria is in the north, is it closer to the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom? Obviously, the northern kingdom, which means that the northern kingdom is feeling the pressure of Assyria more than the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom appeals to the southern kingdom for help. The southern kingdom says, unkindly but wisely, no, we are not going to help you fight Assyria, which is by far the biggest power in the world. Good luck, my brothers and sisters. Take care. Assyria, of course, swallows the northern tribes as though it's nothing. Because not only does, and this is a pattern that happens again and again in Jewish history, not only does the north try to some extent to resist Assyria, but when there are fights within the north, who do they appeal to resolve the fight? Assyria. You may not know this, but leaping ahead many hundreds of years, that's how the Romans ended up in Israel in the first place. Right? The Jews were fighting among themselves, and they turned to the Romans and they said, hey guys, you decide for me instead of for this other guy. And the Romans said, sure, we'll come in and decide. They came in and decided and never left. That's what big powers do, right? So it was only a matter of time before the northern kingdom, and the time was in 722, when Sancheriv, and those of you who know Byron's poem know that he came like a wolf on the fold, Sancheriv destroyed the northern kingdom, and that was it. And what happened to all those tribes? They scattered. The answer is, some of them probably went to places that they were discovered much later in human history, right? Did some of them go to Africa? Probably. Did most of them get absorbed into Assyria? Probably. And did some of them flee south to their brothers and sisters because even though you might hate your family, it's still your family? Yes. That we know. And this, by the way, for those of you, how do I put this the right way? For those of you who doubt whether every word of the Torah was written by God, I don't know who you are, but if there are such people in this heretic assembly, then you might believe that this was the time when the traditions of the North got combined with the traditions of the South. Traditions of Yahweh and traditions of Elohim got put together and created the Torah as we know it. And that those times when the Torah tells the story double or gives two different accounts of things or seems to contradict itself, it's because there was a combination of traditions that happened when the Northerners brought their traditions to the South and they combined all the traditions together, theoretically. Okay, so where am I? I write notes, but I never look at them. That's not a good... all right, we're here. So that means, though, that the Northerners literally had to give up. I mean, we talk about how we weep for the temple, but the Northerners, the temple was in the north, in Shechem, and in Samaria, and in all these places where they believed just as deeply that this was what God wanted, and it was all destroyed. And so they came south with tremendous loss and sadness and so on, in the hope that they could maintain their traditions to the extent that they could. And it certainly changed the way that Judaism was practiced in the South, because any immigration will change a society. That's just the nature of having a whole bunch of people with separate ideas and traditions come into your world. That was 722 BCE when the northern kingdom was destroyed. In the meantime, Assyria, the most powerful nation in the world, was conquered by Babylonia. And now Babylonia was in that northern crescent where Assyria used to be, and of course was also in the north of Israel, where Israel used to be. Once again, there were clashes with Israel and with the Jewish people, and why those clashes happens depends on what accounts you read. But in 586, the temple is finally destroyed. And remember, when I say 586, this is already some 400 years after David, where there's been a whole succession of kings that you can read about. But at this time, when the temple is destroyed, there's a lot of drama that precedes the destruction. And in particular, there are kings that are more Judaically focused and kings that are less Judaically focused. So Chizkiyahu was a king who seemed to want to keep up the traditions of the Jewish people. His son Manasseh, the Bible doesn't like at all. But think about this now historically instead of Judaically. Manasseh ruled for some, 30 years, more or less, and he Assyrianized Jewish worship. Now, I'm sure Manasseh, if he were here, would say, yeah, maybe you don't like the fact that I brought idols into the temple, but guess what? During my time, the Assyrians didn't kill all the Jews in the south. And so, yeah, maybe the Bible doesn't like me because I wasn't a good Jew, but I'll tell you what I was. I was an effective keeper of the peace because I made deals with the Assyrians so that they didn't overrun me. Actually, at the end of his life, he gets deported to Assyria. So it's really hard to Babylonia. It's really hard to appease conquerors. But you try, and then along comes this king, not Manasseh's son. Manasseh's son was named Ammon. He was only king for 2 years, and we can forget about him. But his son was named Josiah. And even though most Jews don't know Josiah, Josiah was actually one of the greatest heroes of Jewish history, because Josiah decided to re-Judaize the South. And he destroyed the priests of Baal. Remember that story with Elijah destroying the priests of Baal and going up on the mountain and the still small voice and Jezebel and kicking her out. This was all during Josiah's revolution. Josiah became king when he was 8 years old. And it was when he was about 20 that he started his revolution. And it was during Josiah's time that the book of Deuteronomy was discovered. And if you read in the book of Kings, you'll see that actually Deuteronomy is all of a sudden discovered. Now, for discovered, some people use the word written. Whether it was written then or discovered then is a scholarly debate that will never be solved, because how can you prove one or the other? But Deuteronomy, although this may not strike you, what Deuteronomy's central theme is, which is not true of any of the other books of the Torah, is to centralize worship in one place. Because for most of Jewish history, Jews had like synagogues all over the place. They didn't have a big temple where everybody went to. But Deuteronomy constantly emphasizes how everyone has to bring sacrifices to the same temple, and the temple has to centralize. So they discovered Deuteronomy, they centralized in the temple, and this is the big Josianic reform. Unfortunately, Josiah was killed in battle, as often happens to kings, and everything fell apart. And you're coming now to the end of the narrative part, and now you're getting to the prophets. So the temple is destroyed, and the people are sent into exile, and all through this, in addition to kings, there are prophets. But prophets, mostly speaking, and I'm not talking about the good prophets, okay? The good prophets are the ones we have left that are written down. But there were prophets all through Israel. There were bands of prophets that would go around and give prophecies to kings. Like kings would say, should I go to war against this person? And they would ask the bands of prophets. And in a way, if you'll forgive the comparison, the prophets were like ChatGPT. That is, they would never tell you anything you didn't want to hear. Like ChatGPT, I have all these bad things on my test from the doctor. What does it mean? Oh, it means you're fine, right? And your dream is a beautiful dream that only somebody as bright as you could come up with this beautiful dream. And that's what the prophets did generally, because if they didn't do that, they were out of a job. And you can imagine when the king surrounds himself with wise people or prophets, he wants to hear what he wants to hear. And it's only the real prophets, the Jeremiahs, the Ezekiels, the Amoses, who, by the way, get treated very badly, who get imprisoned, who get beaten, because they're not telling the king what the king wants to hear, which is, as we know, very difficult to do, right? So Jeremiah, in particular, is extremely concerned about trying to reunite the North and the South, trying to bring back the Northerners who might have assimilated to Assyria or so, and he wants to bring them back into the fold. And if you know the phrase, for example, Haben Yakir li Ephraim, my beloved child Ephraim, that's from Jeremiah. Why? Because Ephraim was one of the northern tribes. And what Jeremiah is saying is, God loves you. Come back to us, to the Jewish people. It's an attempt to reunite the Jews who have strayed or who have gone to Assyria or so on, because Jeremiah really believes that the reuniting of Israel is going to be crucial for redemption. And then what happens, of course, in the end, is that the southern kingdom is destroyed too, and then there is the Babylonian exile, and the book that laments the Babylonian exile is Echa, Lamentations, and there is a tradition, which may in fact be true, we don't know, that Jeremiah was the author of the book of Lamentations. Because as the people leave, and do you remember whose grave it is on the road that weeps for the children as they leave? Rachel's tomb. And again, Rachel is whose mother? Joseph's mother and Benjamin's mother. In other words, Rachel is the mother of the north, right? And she's the one that remembers that the north has been destroyed, and she weeps for her children because long before even the south was destroyed, Rachel's children were already the ones who had been dispossessed and sent throughout the world. So, okay, where are we? So you get other prophets who have other central ideas. Now, I'm just going to mention two or three. One is Isaiah, who's probably the best-known prophet. But Isaiah was probably at least two people, most likely three. Because if you follow Isaiah, like from 1 to 40 mentions certain historical events, from 40 to 66 mention other historical events, and then from there on mention still other historical events. So it seems like it couldn't all be, and this has been said for a long, long time. I mean, classical commentators already noticed this, that Isaiah is a combination of the prophecies of a couple of literary geniuses put together in one book. But Isaiah is the prophet of comfort and of ultimate redemption. And the beautiful images of like the lion laying down with the lamb, those are Isaiah's images. And of going up into the heavens and seeing God seated on a throne and the angels saying, Kadosh, 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 holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. Those are Isaiah's images. So Isaiah is in some ways the grandest of the prophets. And you can imagine that a dispirited people would need not only comfort, but also a vision of what ultimate redemption would be like. That knowledge, I mean, when Maimonides, much later on, writes about what's going to happen at the end of time, he chooses his image from Isaiah. Knowledge of the God will fill the earth as the waters fill the sea, right? That's from Isaiah as well. So you have next to Jeremiah, whose imagery is painful, personal. Jeremiah talks about not wanting to speak God's word, and the imagery in Hebrew is as if God rapes him. In other words, forces him to speak these words. He does it by compulsion. He doesn't want to. Jeremiah is the most reluctant of prophets because he has to speak terrible words to Israel. You're going to be destroyed and you're going to be cast out. And everyone hates Jeremiah as a result, because you can imagine if somebody came along and preached to America, you're all going to be destroyed and you're going to be cast out, Americans would hate that. And even more in ancient Israel. But Jeremiah is also in some ways the most intimate of prophets. He's the one who says, I'm going to remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh, and you should circumcise your heart. And it's internal faith, because he can see that the political winds are all against you, and you have to keep your faith despite that. Isaiah is the prophet of great hope and vision and end times. All of them, by the way, doesn't matter what kind of prophet, they all say you're behaving badly and God's going to punish you. I mean, just take that for granted. And then you get someone like Amos, who's the prophet of what we would call social justice, the oppression of the widow and the orphan, and the fact that people, the reason that Israel's going to be punished is because they don't care about people of a lower social class than they are. And all of these themes, they're not new. They are not new. They're all just baked into human nature and the way that it has always been. And so you have these arcs in the second half of the Torah about the land lost and the land gained, of power being a dangerous thing for people to acquire, but an inevitable thing for people to acquire, because you have to have human leaders. And then every time you have a human leader, they abuse power in different ways, and the prophets are the ones who will speak truth to power. I mean, remember, I think we talked about this last time when David sins with Bathsheba. It's Nathan who comes to him and says, "You're the one who sinned." And that ability to speak truth to power is the prophetic gift. And even though the prophets were discarded sometimes and oppressed and so on, we don't really have a tradition of the prophets being killed, which is true in many other traditions, like Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. They're mistreated horribly, but they manage somehow to survive. And the same is true even going back to the Torah of Moses. You know, it sounds strange to say that no one killed Moses. But the truth is that in most of human history, leaders who say things that people don't want to hear, we know this from even American history, often don't escape with their lives. So the reason that they do is because the one thing that endures is the covenant. The covenant is pronounced in the Torah and then enacted in the Nach, because it isn't really until you get into the land that the covenant is tested. And here is a question that exists today. It hasn't existed for many years, but exists today, which is that the greatest test of the Jewish tradition and its morality is actually not powerlessness, but power. You are tested morally much more when you have power than when you are powerless. Much more when you have the capacity to oppress than when you are the one that is oppressed. And once Israel has its own land, then you judge it differently from when Israel were slaves in Egypt, because you have much more ability to be immoral if you have power. The powerless have very little scope. And I can't is a very different thing from I won't, as everyone knows, right? I mean, to just take an easy and somewhat uncharged example, if you have a kid and you want to raise them not to be spoiled, it's very easy to say to your kid, I can't afford that. It's much harder to say to your kid, I can afford that, but I won't get it for you. Much harder. Power gives you tests. Wealth gives you tests that powerlessness and poverty don't. They're different tests. And it isn't until Israel comes into the land that they have the tests of power. And then the other thing that is important to remember before we talk about what we're going to do next time, and then I'll take questions, is the other remarkable thing about this whole section of the Torah and all of it is that there are no superheroes. Every character is deeply flawed, and even the heroes are flawed. And the only people that don't do something wrong are people who have very short stories. It's really true. If you want to say, this one person did this righteous act, and now let's tell you about the other people, then maybe all you know about the person is they did this righteous act. But everybody who actually has any kind of arc of the narrative, you find out that they do terrible things as well as good things. And even though we may remember them as heroes, once you read the story, you realize that heroes are always, always human. And that's true for everybody in the Torah. It was true in the 5 books, and it's certainly true in Nach again and again and again, whether they are prophets or kings or just ordinary people along the way, including sometimes people who otherwise would seem to be condemnatory but managed to rise to do noble acts. And here, let's circle back just for a minute When I was a kid, I was in Harrisburg up until 6th grade. I went to yeshiva, which is Orthodox religious school. And I remember that we read Joshua, and the only reason I remember it is because I remember we skipped over a part. And so, like probably the rest of my classmates, it was the only time I voluntarily read part of the Bible. Was I wanted to know why, because the teacher said, and we're going to move now, I don't remember what it was, like from chapter 3, let's go to chapter 6. So the reason is because when Joshua and Caleb come into Israel, the person who helps them is Rachav, who is a zonah, which is often translated innkeeper. But zonah in ancient Hebrew, just like in modern Hebrew, does not mean innkeeper, even though I'm sure Motel 6 was useful to her. You can imagine what it actually means. It means, let us say, lady of the evening. But the fact that a prostitute was the one who enabled Joshua and Caleb to be hidden and to be saved is very characteristic of the Torah. It's like, this may not be the person that you would think would prove to be righteous, but you can't judge people so easily, because actually she's the one who proved to be righteous when the rest of the people were not. So it's not only that the heroes prove to be flawed, but the flawed people turn out to be heroes, which is a really wonderful thing and is characteristic of the entire story of the Torah. Now, the thing that we've had so far is we've had narrative, we've had entry into the land, we've had prophecy, and we've had drama. What we haven't had so much is wisdom or piety or prayer, and all of that, or for that matter, really not so much love stories. There's a little bit in Torah and Nach. I wouldn't say there's none, but I mean, not compared to like the average spate of movies or novels or anything like that. All of that gets made up for in the third division of Tanakh, in the Ketuvim. That's where you get Job and Kohelet and the Song of Songs and Jonah and Ruth and stories that reflect wisdom, piety, romance, all of that. But all of that is for next time, and so let's stop there and take questions. And also, philosophy. I don't want to forget that, because I want to probably do at least a good, if not a whole class, a good section on Job, which is philosophy and why do bad things happen to good people, and we'll read Job and find out. Okay, questions, comments?
So I feel like, thank you. Growing up, I mean, just went to like Milton Community High School, Stephen Weiss, and always thought and heard that people in the Torah, they had interactions with God because they were tzaddikim. They were so righteous, so holy. So it's interesting to hear your perspective today. So I guess just connecting the dots to now, if people are flawed, people are not so perfect as they've been positioned in the Torah, why do you think people today don't have a closeness or connection with God the way we've seen interactions in the Torah?
Why is it that people had this connection to God in the Torah and they don't now? Is it because they were holier? So certainly, I would say the traditional view is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were on a level, a madrega is the traditional way of putting it, that we can't begin to approach, and that's why they were close to God. So that's one view. It is also true, and you see this so clearly in the Torah, it's amazing, that God basically levels off as the Torah moves on. Like, God's interaction is less with David than it was with Moses, than it was with Abraham, than it was with Noah, than it was with Adam and Eve. And it's almost as if, to use one analogy that people have used for a long time, it's almost as if God treats human beings like you treat a child. That is, when it's a baby, you're always in their face, right? You have to do everything for them. And as the child grows, you gradually start to move away. Until finally you say, well, the kid's got to make their own decisions. Even though, of course, the decisions they make will not be as wise as the decisions I would have made for them, but they still have to make their own decisions. And there is some of that in the way you see the Torah, which is eventually God's given the law and given you the means to interpret the law, and now you have to decide what to do, because if God is constantly intervening, then you have no will to do things on your own. So I think that that's a lot of it. All I can say is whether you see the characters in the Torah as superhumanly holy depends in part whether you see them by reading the Torah or you see them by reading the way the Talmud looks at the Torah. Because the later tradition definitely elevated them, but you can understand why that would be so. They elevated them not only because these are the heroes of the tradition, and that's what you do. You know, George Washington was so honest that he chopped down the cherry tree and told his father, we elevate the heroes of our tradition. But also because remember that the Jewish tradition was attacked by other traditions. And we had this book that other people could read, and they would say things like, Abraham passes off his wife as his sister. That's not very nice. Your heroes are lousy. And so what do? You say, no, you misunderstand. He seems to do that. But in fact, and then you give explanations that make Abraham seem in fact much holier than he is. And this happens even today. If you go, for example, to different, there are even jokes about this. I'll spare you the jokes, but if you go to different sects who have their own Rebbe, they'll talk about how much holier their Rebbe is than the Rebbe of that guy down the street who pretends to be learned and pretends to be good and so on and so forth, but doesn't hold a candle to the super holiness of my Rebbe. There is a need to elevate one's own, that we follow, which is both, it's human, it's beautiful, it's also dangerous because it sets yourself up for a tremendous disillusionment. But I can't, which leads to something. I just want to say how I've seen this phenomenon so many times, and I just want to call it out and warn you against it. I don't know how many people have come up to me and said, when I was in Hebrew school, or I was at my bar mitzvah lesson, or I was so on, my rabbi said this stupid, insulting, whatever thing to me, and that's why I never walked back into a synagogue. And I will say to them, that would make perfect sense if your rabbi represented the totality of the Jewish tradition for thousands of years. But since it was one person who said one stupid thing, I really think you should give it another shot, right? But I don't know if I said it exactly like that, but you get the idea. But you understand why, because if you elevate somebody, then the disillusion is very great. So, yeah, the safe thing about elevating people who are dead is they're dead. And therefore, if you want to elevate Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov and Ruth and Deborah and Moses, then you're safe.
Thank you. Last time, someone asked the question, so who really wrote the Torah? And you said, I'm not going to tell you now. I'm going to tell you next time or one time. So today I heard you say that the people in the north and the people in the south, when they started to want to, come together, that or it's God, and then you said, or it's maybe these people from the north and the south who came together and wrote things. Is that what you said?
So let me elaborate on that and say that the modern theory of authorship of the Torah, that is, if you don't believe that God word for word wrote the Torah and you think that human beings wrote it, whether you think they wrote it under God's inspiration or they wrote it in part at God's dictation or they just wrote it, whatever, if you assume that there is human authorship of the Torah, then the first thing that you recognize is that the Torah is composed of different strands. There are different parts, and here, by the way, one of the ways that you can, and I don't think anybody, unless I'm vastly underestimating one of you, I don't think anybody here has the expertise to do this, but if I all of a sudden brought someone out here and they said, forsooth, whereth areth the people, you would say, they're not speaking 21st century English. If you read the Torah and you know enough about Hebrew, it's not just that you see that there are contradictions and there are different thematic strands and there are different names used for God, but there are also different levels of Hebrew at different times. And the best way to explain that is that the Torah is a document that was assembled over a long period of time, not all at once by God, unless God, just like scattering fossils all over the world, decided that God would write the Torah in different registers historically. So in other words, you can't possibly disprove that God wrote it, because God can do whatever you think you see in the Torah, God could presumably do. But if that's not your hypothesis, then it's clear that the Torah is a developmental document that is written over a long period of time by different hands who have different concerns. Some of them priestly concerns, because there's a large part of the Torah that really only concerns the priests. As we know, when we have to preach about like skin diseases, this is not what most of us would care about, but if you're a priest, it matters a lot. And then there are stories about God acting one way and stories about God acting another way, and stories that are set in the wilderness and stories that seem to point towards the land, and stories that make Moses the hero and stories that make David the hero, and on and on and on and on. And so the presumption is that different strands, different traditions were combined at different times, and generally, there's a lot of debate about this. And I don't, for a minute, think that I have the expertise to wade into this debate in any kind of intelligent way. But generally, it is assumed that when you have oral traditions, when do those traditions get written down? When they are threatened. So in a time of exile, in a time of destruction, people say, we better write this stuff down, because remember, for most of human history, there were professional reciters who memorized, like as you have today with the Quran, there are people who recite which is much longer than the Torah, who recite the Quran from memory. And in the academies, there were what were called Tanaim. In the Tanaim, you would say, do me a favor, give me Mishnah Sanhedrin 5:2. And they were ideally, honestly, supposed to be not creative personalities. They were basically tape recorders. You didn't want them to be creative because you didn't want them to change the text. You don't want them thinking, you want them reciting. And they would say Mishnah 5:2, blah, 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 blah. Now, these days, we would probably call them neurodivergent. Really, I'm not kidding. Those are probably the kinds of people who had, like Rain Man, had preternatural abilities to remember and recite, and yet would not think of changing the rest. So you had those people with the Torah. But then all of a sudden, there's a time of destruction, and so you say, we better get this written down, and if there are two different traditions, you say, well, just combine them and try to make them as seamless as possible, because we don't want to lose the tradition, because they're both valuable to different communities. And that's why, for example, you have two creation stories. Or if you want to see this in action, I don't know, I'm sure this book is still available. At its time, it was a bestseller, which is a weird thing for a book about the Bible. But Richard Elliott Friedman wrote a book called Who Wrote the Bible? And he will show in that book, he's still alive. I think he taught in San Diego for many years, maybe still does. He also wrote a really interesting book about the Exodus and what he thinks the Exodus story is. And if you don't want to read the whole book, you can read my review of it in the New York Times. But a little plug. But it's a really interesting book. But in that book, he shows you how, for example, you can split the Noah story, and it makes two coherent stories on its own, different with different details, and then he shows how they're combined together to make one story. But it's an astonishing thing when you read it. And so that's the prevailing modern view, although there are 1,000 variations. Some people think it was in the Persian period. Some people think it was right after the destruction. Who knows? Who knows? Unless like one day we discover a document that says, I did it, it was me.
Thank you so much for teaching us. Sure. We so look forward and enjoy. Thank you. I wondered if, just as literature, you have a favorite book of prophets, a favorite prophets, just as literature, no matter who wrote it, and
a favorite prophet or a favorite book of the Bible? Those are two different things.
Book, not prophet, as it's written, for instance. And why it appeals to you?
Well, it'll be probably my favorite book, although I don't know that I would necessarily say as literature. My favorite book is probably Ecclesiastes, but not necessarily because of literature. In terms of stories, it's really hard to beat Genesis. I mean, Genesis is, the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah and Adam and Eve. Like the Adam and Eve story is, so I got to say, as literature, I would go with Genesis. But in terms of mining for a lifetime, I really think, we'll talk about it next time, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which you can read in half an hour, but you can also read forever, is the most remarkable work in a lot of ways. Job's pretty good too. Going once. Going twice. Okay, so then next time we will do the third division of the Torah. We may not finish the whole thing, and then we will move on over the course of this year or next year or years to come to the Middle Ages and to poetry and to tshuvot and philosophy and other stuff too. All right, thanks a lot. Bye.